Good afternoon or good evening. Welcome to the second panel of today's Schiller Institute International Conference, Inspiring Humanity to Survive the Greatest Crisis in World History. I'm Harley Schlanger of the Schiller Institute, and I will moderate this panel, which is titled Defend the Right to Deliberate, Speak Out Against Blacklists and the Suppression of the Search for Truth. It is often said that truth is the first casualty of war. Given that this has been demonstrated throughout history, it should follow that preventing conflicts which might lead to war, or ending wars once they begin, requires an honest process of deliberation and dialogue between the parties. In the prelude to the present conflict in Ukraine, there was a prolonged effort by one side to address the question of security guarantees, a discussion which was repeatedly sabotaged by the NATO powers, whose leaders refused to even allow an honest dialogue to take place. The result is a deadly conflict which is deepening. Meanwhile, the transatlantic side continues to suppress the discussion of mutual security guarantees, insists that there be no negotiations, and is pouring in weapons and financial support to continue the fighting with the intent, as stated by U.S. Defense Secretary Austin and Ramstein several months ago, to weaken Russia. Instead of dialogue, those who call for negotiations to end the conflict are placed on a hit list by Ukraine's Center to Combat Disinformation, labeled information terrorists and war criminals and Putin propagandists. Some of them have been placed on a second list called Mirotvorets, which security experts have identified as a kill list. Some on the list have already been victims of assassination, including Russian journalist and activist Daria Dugina, killed by a car bomb near Moscow on August 20th, with compelling evidence pointing to Ukrainian special forces as behind the killing. In the interest of full disclosure, let me add that I'm included on both lists. On September 7th, the Executive Intelligence Review sponsored a press briefing titled Ukraine Blacklist Targets from the U.S. and Abroad Speak Out, Demand Congressional and UN Action to Shut Down Kiev's Kill List Operations. Speakers included military and intelligence professionals, candidates, journalists, and peace activists. A video of that press briefing is available on the schillerinstitute.com website. This panel will begin with a summary of the EIR report on the kill list, followed by speakers who are on that kill list. You will hear that this operation is not only funded by the US, the UK governments, and NATO, but officials from those governments have participated in discussions and planning sessions in Kiev to coordinate the silencing of opposing voices, without any of them ever speaking out against it. Our purpose in this panel is not to complain, as we're going to stick with Helga's intent to provide solutions. It's our intention to change this. This must be exposed, the funding cut, and these operations shut down. Freedom of speech is one of the fundamental rights for American citizens, guaranteed by the First Amendment to our Constitution. After hearing from our panel, I hope you'll be moved to join us in our demands that this attempt to silence opposing views, including by assassination, cannot be tolerated and must be shut down. The keynote to this panel is going to be given by Diane Sare, who is a candidate for U.S. Senate from New York. Her opponent is Charles Schumer, who's one of the people who's argued most vehemently for funding these special operations of the Ukrainian government. Diane's keynote address is titled, The Best of All Possible Worlds.
Okay, I guess I'm up. Thank you very much, Harley. And I shall begin. If you're one of a tiny group of ultra-rich elites who thinks the world can only sustain about 1 billion out of the 8 billion people now living here, one thing you better make sure is that the 7 billion people that you're intending to eliminate don't talk to each other. Even if you don't want to kill all 7 billion of them, but plan to starve about 1 or 2 billion and loot and impoverish the rest, you're really going to be much more successful if your intended victims can be induced to believe that some of your other victims are the enemy. Think of the irony of Americans fuming at the illegals streaming across our borders. It's popular to call them illegals as opposed to migrants, refugees, or displaced persons, but to take a lowly adjective with a negative connotation, namely illegal, and convert it to a noun so you can keep your distance from their humanity. Don't you realize that if you do nothing about the plight of these people, that you will meet a similar fate? It is true that if you consider the cause of their misery and who is using them as a political tool, you will confront an evil which is most uncomfortable to countenance. We had a perfect example of this old British royal principle of divide and conquer a week ago Thursday, when President Biden asserted that 75 million Americans who voted for Donald Trump were, in effect, enemies of the state. So if you're not with Biden, you're a traitor, and no decent American should be seen associating with you, because that would imply that they're a traitor too. And people are programmed to be divided from their peers. That is, you're not supposed to talk to people who disagree with you. As a candidate, I get asked all the time, where do you stand on X? With the frequent result that the questioner storms off saying that there is nothing more to discuss, throwing me into the heap of the untouchables. And the people in this binary mindset also have no sense of humor or irony. For example, when one woman asked me, where do you stand on a woman's right to choose? And I said, well, I certainly don't think that babies should be aborted up until the age of 13. She hissed that people like me were always saying that and slammed her car door in my face. End of conversation. When I point out that no one, and this is still true, has yet asked me where I stand on the fact that 14,000 newborn infants died of starvation in Afghanistan just between January and March, people aren't interested. They think my position on Roe v. Wade is far more important, or my position on Donald Trump, whatever that means. I can't even figure that one out, so I've been unable to fit into their box, which is a good thing, because this box that they're trying to put me in and put all of us in, the binary box, is probably somewhat like the box that Genghis Khan used to put his victims inside of, where they were suffocated to death while he used the box as a dining table to gorge himself on an extravagant dinner. This problem of Americans and Western Europeans, as I've encountered, in not being able to think outside of the box, so to speak, has had me very concerned about whether we're going to be able to survive. After all, the first step toward making a change is to recognize that perhaps there's an element in your underlying hypothesis of life which is anomalous. It doesn't fit in. A paradox that bears some investigation, which might cause us to completely alter our worldview if we stop to examine it. So while we and our friends and family members are all being self-righteously divided from each other, I would ask you to consider a few things that are pretty obvious. Take the price of gasoline. Now, the last time you put gas in your car, and I know all of us are thrilled that the price of gas is going down so fast because of the fantastic policies of the Biden administration, who has been lowering the price of gasoline at a greater rate than any administration ever in history. Of course, if they hadn't tripled it to begin with, we might be happier about this. But at any rate, does the person who voted for Donald Trump pay the same price for gasoline as the guy who voted for Liz Cheney or Joe Biden Or is it different? And when New York City experiences a major power outage because we foolishly shut down the Indian Point nuclear power plant, will it be only the illegals in the decrepit homeless shelters who suffer the consequences? Or will it be your 90-year-old aunt on the 10th floor of her apartment building? I'm sure if they could figure out how to only have the blackouts affect the poor, and they're doing some of that, they would do it. But believe me, when you insist on being an immoral bastard, you become stupid as well. So when we have a transatlantic coalition spearheaded by the witless Biden administration, which is actually controlled by the GCHQ, deciding that Putin must be brought down, even if every last Ukrainian between the age of 18 and 60 has to die, including the 50,000 women soldiers whom Zelensky is bragging about, whom does that affect? Do you think all of the Ukrainians are cheering Slava Ukraina with their dying breath? I doubt it. In fact, we know that probably most of them don't want to be in this war. Ukrainians who would wish to surrender are prohibited from doing so, and even Zelensky was prevented at least twice from negotiating an end to the war by Boris Johnson and/or the Biden administration and NATO. And after having slaughtered millions of people around the world through wars, as in Vietnam, through Iraq and beyond, or through policies of economic privation, as Malcolm X warned us would happen, the chickens are coming home to roost. We are now experiencing the full force of the results of our policies against humanity. The soaring inflation of the price of food and fuel, the lack of parts for our automobiles, the lack of fertilizer for our farmers, which will result in a lack of food. We have brought this down upon our own heads. Lyndon LaRouche saw this coming already in the 1950s, and he warned about it, and he recruited an entire movement to do something about it. He became a figure of presidential stature and ran for president 8 times, using these campaigns to mobilize the American people through publications and nationwide television broadcasts. As a result, he became the target of this Anglo-Dutch liberal cabal, which then moved to silence him, not only through attempted assassinations, but consider that his publications, which had hundreds of thousands of subscribers, were declared involuntarily bankrupt by the US government and shut down. That his formerly extremely effective half-an-hour nationwide television broadcasts were priced out of reach. He was called political extremist and conspiracy theorist and lunatic fringe, all to prevent people from publicly associating with him for fear of what their neighbors would think. With the assault on Lyndon LaRouche, the American people had been placed in Genghis Khan's box, and they didn't even know it. Americans thought it was Lyndon LaRouche and his associates who were in prison, but it was actually you who were in the torture box as a result of our government's treatment of LaRouche. And I say our government advisedly because we know that it was the British so-called intelligence that gave the orders to silence LaRouche's voice. So now we get back to Ukraine. What kind of unfathomable evil is this, where people are sent off to a horrible death and our government is willfully pushing them over the cliff? The same goes for the mass starvation and the horrors unleashed by the sanctions which we are imposing on literally dozens of nations. And finally, we too are suffering from the results of the actions of our governments. Many Europeans and Americans, as was mentioned in the previous panel, are about to have a very cold and hungry winter ahead. I'm getting messages on Facebook from people saying, my Social Security check doesn't cover the price of meat, so I'm just eating rice and beans. To the great dismay of the recently departed Queen of England and her son, now the ruler of the collapsing wreck known as the British Empire, two leaders decided to break out of the box. And that was the February 4th meeting between Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping, meeting on the sidelines of the Olympics and signing an agreement to stand with each other for certain universal principles, human dignity, including scientific and economic progress. This powerful combination will certainly not be defeated by economic sanctions, especially since the number of nations now joining this new order probably exceeds 40% of the world's population, and maybe it's substantially higher, even more than a majority. So the more now we talk about isolating them, the more we discover that it is we ourselves who are isolated. It was with great relief that I discovered, not having bothered to think about it recently, that the United States, with our 332 million people, only represents 4% of the world's population. And we run around lecturing people about democracy. We 4%, we're going to tell the rest of you how to live your lives and run your countries. Seems a little undemocratic to me. It seems to be maybe only the nuclear bomb that makes us capable of enforcing this kind of democracy. And the population of the UK is not even 1% of the worldwide population. So perhaps you get a glimmer of why it is so necessary to keep the rest of us divided. That's the purpose of the kill list, both to silence us through fear, using examples like Daria Dubina or Julian Assange and any other number of whistleblowers who are currently incarcerated, and of course the case of LaRouche, and to make sure that the 7 billion people who are being herded into the boxcars don't talk to us by labeling us as information terrorists or political extremists or insurrectionists. And as I said, the number of people getting on the boxcars is probably less than 7 billion because so many of them are getting off the boxcars and getting onto a high-speed train for a more promising destination. This is why the Russian soldiers have the morale to keep up what is a very difficult fight against an enemy which is both sadistic and irrational, including Nazi Azov battalion soldiers who, like ISIS fighters, are drugged in order to be able to carry out unthinkable atrocities. This is why the young people in Iraq, after 30 years of war, and the young people of Yemen remain optimistic. And this is why also the American people are so deeply pessimistic, because we're on the wrong side of history. We've abandoned the principles which once made us a beloved nation which inspired the whole world. We have seen time and time again how courage begets courage, which is why Helga Zepp-LaRouche in particular is so important, and why each of the panelists here today represents an important spark of resistance to the would-be rule of law by the less than 1%. My greatest fear is not that these sadistic genocidal perverts will be successful in their schemes of global dictatorship, because I know they won't be. But when their bankrupt and collapsing system finally implodes of its own pompous weight, will we be sane enough to work with Russia and China, as LaRouche insisted? Or will we unleash a new dark age from which the human race never recovers? This is why the censorship must be ended. This is why in this year of his centenary, Lyndon LaRouche must be exonerated. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Diane. I should point out that Diane will be on the ballot in New York State as the LaRouche Party or LaRouche Independent Party, one of 3 candidates, but the most important one challenging Chuck Schumer. For those just joining us, this is the second panel of our International Schiller Conference today. The topic is Defend the Right to Deliberate, Speak Out Against Blacklists, and Suppression of the Search for Truth. Let me point out that in so-called democratic Ukraine, political opposition parties have been shut down, opposition leaders, including from the parliament, put in jail, and most of the opposition media has been shut down. This is in the so-called democratic state that our tax dollars are going to defend. So it's not just foreigners they're trying to silence. Now, our next presentation will be from Gretchen Small of the Executive Intelligence Review, giving a report on what the Executive Intelligence Review has put together on this suppression of truth operation. It's titled, Shut Down Ukraine Center for Countering Disinformation, Global NATO's Thought Police. Gretchen?
Most people in the world had never heard of the Center for Countering Disinformation at Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council before July 25th of this year, when the news broke internationally that the CCD, its English acronym, had published a blacklist of over 70 personalities labeled Russian propagandists, foreigners in the service of Kremlin propaganda, with all that that entails. No one at EIR and the Schiller Institute had heard of the CCD either, although the CCD certainly knew about the Schiller Institute. The first 31 international figures on the list had spoken at conferences organized by the Institute this year to discuss the creation of a new international security and development architecture. So EIR set up a task force to investigate. We confirmed that at least 6 of the people named on the CCD list also appear on the infamous Morotvaritz assassination list, 3 of them specifically on the basis of the CCD having designated them as Russian propagandists. Unlike the CCD, Morotvaritz, whose Orwellian name translates as peacemaker, is quite well known internationally. It has been investigated by the United Nations Human Rights Commission and the French Office for the Protection of Refugees and Stateless. In 2016, it had even been called out by the G7 ambassadors to Ukraine for targeting foreign journalists. The French report found the terrorist site to have been linked from its start in 2014 to officials in the Ukrainian Interior Ministry, the Security Service, that is the SBU, and the Border Guard Service. Yet it still operates today, which could not happen without the acquiescence of Ukraine's international partners. But while we may not have heard of the CCD, we discovered that NATO, the US and British governments, and the European Union not only knew about it, they helped create it, fund it, work with it, and support the CCD's move to silence international opposition to global NATO's attempt to become the policeman of the world. Let me be clear, EIR is not making up accusations. We know the monstrous intent of this blacklist operation from the mouths of the CCD and its backers themselves. And we found the proverbial foreign pay stubs for it as well. Not from anonymous sources familiar with the matter either, but from public sources. EIR has published the first results of its investigation in its September 2nd issue. Here I will highlight just a few key findings. As I do, keep in mind the fascist outlook of the CCD, which glorifies the neo-Nazi Azov and right sector brigades as symbols of the Ukrainian struggle, that's what they call them, and describes Ukrainian society as, quote, consolidating around hatred of Russia. Let the implications of such statements sink in. So on July 14th, the day the CCD released its list of international foreigners in the service of Kremlin propaganda, the CCD's acting head, Andrei Shapovalov, told an international roundtable on countering disinformation in Kiev that, quote, People who deliberately spread disinformation are information terrorists. He demanded laws be changed so that information terrorists, quote, will have to answer to the law as war criminals. That roundtable was funded by the United States State Department. One of its co-sponsors was an outfit named Civilian Research and Development Foundation Global. CRDF Global is not the independent nonprofit it claims to be, but a U.S. state-sponsored operation, founded in 1995 by congressional mandate, funded by the U.S. state and defense departments, the UK and Canadian governments, and the usual private foundations, and led by a team sporting long careers in the military-industrial complex. Minimally, 2 representatives from NATO, 2 from the CRDF Global, an official from GCHQ, that's the United Kingdom's National Security Agency, and 1 strategic communications specialist of the European Union for External Research Service participated in the discussion of Shapovalov's proposal for how Russian propagandists spreading disinformation should be treated as terrorists. We later discovered that the CRDF Global has co-sponsored, funded, and provided technical personnel and training so often to Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council cybersecurity and counter disinformation operations that you might conclude that the Security Council doesn't operate without its okay. Some U.S. congressmen, such as Virginia Senator Tim Kaine, who wrote a concerned constituent that he does not believe that the CCD poses a threat to the safety of Americans, should take heed. When President Zelensky's close aide, Mikhailo Podolyak, was questioned by the Indian daily The Print at the end of July about the CCD blacklist, Podolyak aggressively defended the inclusion of representatives of foreign states in what he called military lustration lists. He called them this absolutely justified. And then he said, I will repeat once again because it's important. These people are a kind of instrument of war. Ukraine is obliged to limit the influence of such people, end of quote. The CCD has functioned under international direction since it was formally launched in April 2021 at a meeting with the ambassadors of 9 countries, that included all the G7 ambassadors, and heads of the European Union and NATO offices in Ukraine. Andrei Yermak, the head of President Zelensky's Office of the President, told those present that the CCD was to function as, quote, an international hub, unquote, for countering disinformation. Officially, it has 2 responsibilities. One is combating information terrorism. That means fingering propagandists for prosecution or killing. Shapovalov told a Ukrainian interviewer last February, we see the full media picture of Ukraine around the world, and we inform the National Security and Defense Council about it. We hand over everything useful and most interesting that we find to the SBU. Even the Washington Post admitted this past Thursday, September 8th, that the SBU, Ukraine's infamous security service, has a special unit to liquidate opponents. The CCD's other responsibility is its role as an international hub, quote unquote. So we can assume the CD passes its everything useful onto its international partners also. For example, in the same interview where he talked about fingering people for the SBU, Shapovalov reported that the CCD, quote, collects evidence of hate speech against Ukraine for use in international courts, end of quote. I do not have the time here to detail the initial history presented in EIR's dossier on how the United States, NATO, and the United Kingdom moved in like gangbusters after the 2014 Maidan coup to instruct Ukrainian officials on how to organize strategic communications and how to run counter-disinformation operations. To suffice it to say that foreign control over Ukraine's censorship operations did not start with the CCD. But when you look at these operations, it becomes clear that Ukraine is being used as NATO's proxy to crush global opposition to NATO worldwide, as well as its proxy for war against Russia. On last March 28th, the CCD issued a document titled Information Terrorism, a Crime Against Humanity. This is detailed at some length in EIR's dossier. It argues, and here I quote again, the international community must officially recognize information terrorism and declare Russia an info-terrorist state. Infoterrorism must be equated with actual terrorism and requires appropriate measures to counter it. End of quote. The CCD demanded that the international community agree that anyone involved in any way whatsoever with so-called info-terror be treated as an information terrorist. The CCD also asserted that it is, quote, obligatory to designate a list of individuals sponsoring information terrorism, end quote, who are then to be sanctioned. Now remember, the people on the CCD's July blacklist are charged with being info terrorists for saying such obvious things as sanctions against Russia have backfired against other parts of the world. Or as was the case with Helga LaRouche, specifically for organizing, quote, an international discussion on the new architecture of world security and the threat of World War III. That makes Helga a war criminal. There was enough international blowback against the CCD for its blacklist that it removed it from its main website on August 11th, although it is still visible on its Telegram channels. The operation, however, is proceeding apace. On September 2nd, the CCD and the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine reported that they had just held another international roundtable, this one a 2-day conference on, quote, combating disinformation under conditions of military operations. This was attended by representatives of 24 nations. They listed 18 speakers, 15 of them from their international partners. The whole gang was there. The U.S. Embassy's public relations officer, the charge d'affaires of the French embassy, Germany's political affairs officer, the head of NATO's Stratcom partnership with Ukraine, etc., etc. Shapovalov repeated the CCD litany. International law must recognize info-terrorism as a crime, and anyone committing such a crime must be designated an information terrorist and subjected to measures such as are applied to actual terrorists. The CCD claims all parties present agreed. If thinking and dialoguing about policy, what we are doing here today, is now to be considered terrorism to be silenced, we are way beyond George Orwell's 1984. This operation must be shut down.
Thank you, Gretchen. Let me point out to people that the full report that Gretchen was reporting from is available, the full dossier, at the Executive Intelligence Review website, LaRouchePub.com. Our next speaker will be Colonel Richard H. Black. Colonel Black is someone who's participated with us before. He's the former head of the U.S. Army's Criminal Law Division at the Pentagon and a former Virginia State Senator. His interviews with EIR have been, including one on the danger of NATO provoking nuclear war, have gone viral on the internet. His topic today is Forbid Unlawful Efforts to Silence American Citizens. Colonel Black?
What we're going to be talking about is the fact that the U.S. Congress, through its appropriations, has been funding the Ukrainian Center for Countering Disinformation. And they are attempting, by doing this, to be able to control freedom of speech, not directly in this country, which is clearly unlawful, but by having a foreign entity do it, where they can suppress free speech using American dollars to do it overseas. I'm going to start off because, you know, the 71 people who have been put on the hit list by the Ukrainian Center for Disinformation, what I call hit list, but basically it's a list condemning us as war criminals, info terrorists, and Russian propagandists. And so I want to make it clear that that is quite wide of the mark. And so I'm just going to give myself as an example, but I think everyone who is involved could probably give something similar. So let me just start by giving you a little of my background, because I want to make it very clear that I love my country. I've risked my life for it hundreds of times. I volunteered to fight in Vietnam. Myself and a fellow named Mike Harley, two Marine Corps pilots, became the first two volunteers from the East Coast helicopter forces to volunteer to go over to Vietnam and join the West Coast chopper pilots who were already in Vietnam. While I was there, I flew 269 combat missions. My helicopter was hit by ground fire on 4 of those flights. And in one case, bullets that were aimed directly at me just were a little bit too early, and they tore through the cowling of the cockpit just before my head, but very nearly hit me and were aimed at me. Later, during my tour of duty, I was fighting on the ground, and I heard that Mike Harley was shot through the face and killed as he flew Marine infantrymen into battle not 10 miles away from me. Now, I was flying off the carrier Iwo Jima in the South China Sea near the coast of the Philippines when the flight operations officer at the ready room briefed us in the morning, and he said that our squadron had been tasked with providing a volunteer to fight on the ground with the 1st Marine Division, which was heavily engaged in combat at the time. I immediately volunteered, went to work with the 1st Marine Division, and fought in 70 often bloody combat patrols. During my final patrol, I was wounded, and both of my radio men were killed, Corporal Henry Smith, Lance Corporal Dennis Wargo. They died right next to me after we had launched a rubber boat assault and successfully landed on the far side of the Hoi An River under enemy fire. I served a total 32 years in uniform. First, of course, as a Marine pilot, and then later as an Army lawyer. I ran legal offices at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, Fort Ord, California, and Fort Lewis, Washington. I would typically supervise 25 to 40 Army lawyers. Finally, I retired as chief of the criminal law division at the Pentagon, where I testified before Congress, advised the Senate Armed Services Committee on issues of national importance, and prepared executive orders that were signed by the President of the United States. So all of that said, I'm adamantly opposed to our current wars, and especially the very, very dangerous war that we've engaged in Ukraine. I believe that the US, the UK, and the European Union have embarked on an imprudent course of action that carries a significant risk of eventually triggering an all-out nuclear war. Now, recently, Department of Homeland Security tried to establish a domestic center for countering disinformation here in the United States. Fortunately for us, Nina Jankowicz, an outrageous, narcissistic young lady, was the Department of Homeland Security pick to become agency head. Her presentation to the public was so bizarre that Americans simply recoiled at the idea of someone like her censoring their thoughts and expressions. So the U.S. Center for Disinformation, run by DHS, has temporarily been blocked because of its potential for violating Americans' First Amendment freedoms. But DHS did not limit their censorship information efforts to the United States. It has exported them into Ukraine. And by the way, Nina Jankowicz is a very accomplished Ukrainian linguist who is very deeply involved in governmental affairs there leading up to the war. It is difficult to imagine that she is not really up to her knees in the information suppression efforts of Ukraine. The Center for Countering Disinformation in Ukraine is financed by the U.S. government under H.R. 7691, which is called the Additional Supplemental Appropriations Act of 2022. This provides funding for the Ukrainian government and for its Center for Countering Disinformation. Now, many of the people they've targeted, including Senator Rand Paul and former Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, are very patriotic American citizens with strong, well-informed views on foreign policy. It's the intention of Department of Homeland Security and the Ukrainian Center for Disinformation to silence us. For example, there was a communique that came in the other day relative to a conference, September 1st and 2nd. This was put on by Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council and its now notorious Center for Countering Disinformation. There were representatives from NATO, from the United States State Department, and from European nations in attendance. Oleksiy Danilov, the secretary of the Ukrainian National Security and Defense Council, said, "Today, our goal is to form an international hub for countering information threats at the national and international level." He said that international law must recognize infoterrorism as a crime, and that anyone committing such a crime should be declared an information terrorist, subjected to measures that are applied to actual terrorists, which presumably includes the death penalty. It's unlawful for a U.S. agency to fund a foreign agency in order to censor American citizens. If it's unlawful for the agency to do it here, it's unlawful for them to fund and to pay off another country to do it over there. The Ukrainian Center for Countering Disinformation makes available names and personal information to a murderous Kiev-based website, MyRotVerets, which is suspected of encouraging such killings as the Moscow car bombing of Daria Dugina, who was the daughter of a prominent Russian activist and journalist. They have also listed on their website, which is very extensive, includes thousands of people, and they've included hundreds of children whose crime is that they posted pro-Russian Facebook entries on their computers. Now, also, while the facts remain very speculative, and I want to be clear on that, the Rio Times now sees links between Ukraine and the attempted assassination of Argentina's Vice President, Cristina Kirchner. Kirchner was criticized early on by Ukrainian sympathizers for refusing to harshly condemn Russia's special operation in Ukraine and for calling for peace talks to end the war. Now, whether the Ukrainian Center for Countering Disinformation is involved or not, these violent acts suggest that the CCD is encouraging them. They may not be behind them, but they are certainly encouraging them. And so it's our position that the congressional appropriations must explicitly forbid Ukraine from using funds to silence patriotic American voices. Thank you.
Thank you, Colonel Black. If you're just joining us, welcome to the Schiller Institute International Conference. This is the second panel on the title, Defend the Right to Deliberate, Speak Out Against Blacklists and the Suppression of the Search for Truth. We will be taking questions after the other panel members speak. If you have questions for us, send them to us at questions@schillerinstitute.org. Our next speaker is George Coup, who's also addressed Schiller Institute conferences previously. He's a retired business consultant, the chairman of Burlingame Foundation. His topic is America Must End Funding a Hit List. George?
Hello, everyone. My name is George Coup. I'm a retired international business advisor, and I write commentaries on the U.S.-China relations as a hobby and occupation. So I was somewhat surprised, really, and puzzled that somehow my name was made on that blacklist, which we're all talking about. The only thing I know about Ukraine and Russia, I've been to both countries as tourists, but otherwise, I really don't claim to have any expertise on either countries. I think I participated in a Schiller conference where I was primarily invited to comment about where China stands or stood in the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. And I probably said something to the effect that the war was, the U.S. and the NATO was really responsible and complicit in pushing Russia into this particular conflict. But I certainly didn't say anything about the history of corruption of Ukraine. I certainly didn't say anything about the Nazis, in the right-wing Nazis dominating Ukraine. So it's on the one hand, flattering to be part of all the luminaries that have been made into this blacklist. On the other hand, I strongly resent that if this blacklist is a result of government funding from the U.S., it seems to be a wanton waste of our taxpayers' money. It's not justified. Heaven knows that our leaders, military and government or otherwise, we kill other people routinely. We use drones to assassinate leaders from other countries. And so far as I know, none of them has made any blacklists of any kind. And here we are considered to be the enemies of Ukraine. So I just want to add my 2 cents and voice my displeasure and complaint and protest for the existence of this particular blacklist. And I hope that the people in our government will take this to heed and investigate and stop this kind of nonsense. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George. Our next speaker is a retired diplomat, a former diplomat, James Jatras, who is also the former advisor to the U.S. Senate Republican leadership. His topic is Schiller Institute, Lightning Rod to Meet Perilous Times. James?
I want to express my gratitude to Helga Zepp-LaRouche and the Schiller Institute and the LaRouche organization to invite me to participate in this very important event. We live in very perilous times. We are living with an increasing threat of global war because of the way the Biden administration, with the support of not only Democrats in Congress, but Republicans in Congress, have been pressing this proxy war against Russia and Ukraine, the threats we have in the Far East over Taiwan. I don't think we could overstate how dangerous this is. At the same time, we have the Biden administration essentially declaring war on a huge segment of the American people, declaring them to be enemies of the people, enemies of democracy, fascists, as he stands before a backdrop of what only can be considered a fascist scene from a movie somewhere. And then we have to add to that yet another ingredient with this so-called hit list, or this identification from the Ukrainian government of people that they designate as information terrorists, as essentially combatants in this proxy war. And as we know, some of these lists really set up people for assassinations. We saw recently with Daria Dugina. And the worst thing about this, what we have to say as Americans, is we are funding all of this. This is our money being poured down into this effort that's then being used to turn around and designate Americans in this way and potentially set them up for violence against them by one or a number of intelligence services around the world. And more than that, and I don't think sufficient attention has been paid to this, not only are we funding these activities by the Ukrainian government, but almost certainly, in my professional opinion, as a former Senate staffer and a former Foreign Service officer, almost certainly our intelligence agencies are complicit in drawing up these lists and identifying individuals who will be targeted in this way. So I think it's very important for us. We have a big job ahead of us if we want to recover any kind of sense of integrity to our government, to demand that these kind of activities stop, that Congress cut off the funding for these kind of activities, that a light is shine on whoever is behind this in our government and has been complicit with this. And I say this is a big task because at this point, there's very, very little pushback from anybody in positions of power in Congress, and certainly not the Democrats, and even almost all of the Republicans are on board with these things. So people do need to mobilize. They need to voice their opinion to Congress, to the media, and so forth, to demand that these activities be stopped. And that's why I do want to pay special tribute to Helga LaRouche and to the LaRouche organizations and the Schiller Institute for being not only the flagship in pushing against this, but also clearly being willing to be the lightning rod, to be the people who are being singled out by this out of control, undemocratic and intolerable activity by our government. I think, and I hope that people will notice that the role that's being played by this organization and will support it.
Well, Jim, thank you for that. You're participating in the second panel of the International Schiller Institute Conference on Defending the Right to Deliberate. Our next speaker is David Pyne. He's the Deputy Director of National Operations for the EMP Task Force on National and Homeland Security. He also writes for the National Interest. His topic is, how is promoting a realistic peace plan a war crime? David?
Hello. First of all, I would like to thank EIR for hosting and inviting me to speak briefly during this panel discussion. I think it's very important, very timely, given that President Biden has, recently issued this primetime tirade announcing 74 million Americans who are supportive of America First policies, American First foreign policy, as domestic violent extremists and fascists. And I think that his administration has been the one who's actually pursuing such fascistic methods and policies, and trying to censor free thought, and especially any thoughts that would go against the administration's war policy in support of instead of ending the war in Ukraine, but actually lengthening it. So just to give a little background, I currently work as the Deputy Director of National Operations for the EMP Task Force on National Homeland Security. I'm a former U.S. Army combat arms officer. I also worked as an international programs manager, Department of the Army headquarters staff in charge of armaments cooperation with the former Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and the Americas from 2000 to 2003. I've got 2 graduate degrees, including a master's degree in national security studies from Georgetown University. And I'm currently serving as a contributor to the National Interest Foreign Policy Journal. I was also a contributor to Dr. Peter Pry's book, Blackout Warfare, as well as his upcoming book, Will America Be Protected, which is due later this year. And finally, I'm editor of a newsletter entitled The Real War, which is available at dpyne.substack.com. So back in January, I began writing a number of articles in support of peace and the national interest. And I warned that if the Biden administration didn't agree to Russia's essential basic demand that we issue a written guarantee that Ukraine would never be allowed to join NATO, then Russia would invade Ukraine later the following month, and that's exactly what happened. And then I began writing a number of articles with ideas for how we could negotiate a mutual security agreement, similar but not exactly the same as to what Russia proposed back in December, and kind of de-escalate our hostilities and all of our conflicts with Russia, so that we could re-establish a more just and lasting peace in Europe and avoid any future conflicts with Russia. And then on June 18th, I published a 15-point peace plan to end the war in Ukraine. And that is something that put me on the radar of Ukraine. I previously had published a peace plan that was back in early March, actually, and received some negative feedback from a Ukrainian source in April, denouncing me as a quote unquote paid agent of the Kremlin. And in this subsequent article in June, it was essentially all about ending the war with a peace, with kind of a Wilsonian peace without victory. And it was under my proposal, Ukraine, of course, would become neutral in terms of cutting off all ties with NATO. And that's something that Zelensky he said he was open to and would accept as early as February of this year after the invasion. And then they would also, Russia would have to withdraw from all Ukrainian territory. I don't, consider Crimea to be part of Ukraine anymore, because obviously it was annexed by Russia back in 2014. Except for the Donbass, and the Donbass region would have a popular referendum to decide on the question of independence. And that is what got me in trouble and put on this blacklist that was issued by the Ukrainian Center for Countering Disinformation, which I've since learned is U.S. government funded, which I find very disturbing. And I've received a deluge of negative emails, smear emails from Ukrainians attacking me, using a lot of profanity, and again denouncing me as a Russian agent for publishing this very sincere peace proposal, which I think would be fair to both Ukraine and Russia. I think it's something that is realistic. We have to be realistic. I'm a foreign policy realist, and it's something that I think would end the war and end the death and destruction in Ukraine, and we could accomplish that very quickly and have a return to normalcy in Europe, which would allow for the process of Ukrainian reconstruction to begin. So. I also learned that noted national security strategist Edward Lutvak was put on the Ukrainian blacklist for the same reason that I was, and that he'd also proposed some sort of popular referendum in the Donbass region on the question of independence as a potential compromise. And I do want to say that I've since seen some signals from the Russian government that they would be supportive of a peace plan along the lines that I've issued. So despite the obvious fact that they're directly responsible for the war in Ukraine because they invaded Ukraine, they've actually been the most interested in peace because they have very limited objectives that they've articulated beginning the day after their invasion. I've been tracking all of their peace proposals, and their peace proposals have remained the same since early March. Again, the only major difference between what I propose and what they propose is the idea of a popular referendum, which I think they're coming around to, but that would leave open the possibility that Ukraine could expel Russian forces from all of Ukraine, including the Donbass, were they the people of the Donbass to choose to stay with Ukraine versus becoming independent. So it's very difficult for me to understand how the Ukrainian government could possibly term me as, denounce me as a Russian agent, given that possibility that this could provide them with the opportunity to essentially win the war in a bloodless victory. I've learned that other more well-known Americans on this list include Senator Rand Paul, former Representative Tulsi Gabbard, Colonel Douglas McGregor, and Dr. John Mearsheimer, who's one of our premier foreign policy analysts from the Realist School, as I am. And in no way are any of us disseminating or guilty of disseminating Russian disinformation. I think the only real offense that we've committed is that we are much more supportive of a policy of peace rather than war, and that we've been very patriotic. And in that support, America's lasting foreign policy, at least prior to World War I, was one of supporting peace and being the peacemaker of the world rather than the peacekeeper of the world. In terms of being a world policeman, I think we need to return to doing that. But Biden's undeclared proxy war against Russia and Ukraine, particularly in terms of providing long-range rockets to Ukraine, which to strike Russian targets inside Russian territory, I think are greatly increasing the chances of Russian nuclear escalation. And the constant onslaught of Ukrainian government war propaganda and disinformation has really had a negative impact on our national security. And I think it's something that we need to counter, because the number one national security interest of the United States is to avoid a nuclear war with Russia and China. So, since that list was issued, I'm very pleased to hear that as of August 11th, the Ukrainian Center for Countering Disinformation removed its disgraceful blacklist of American citizens and folks from other Western countries on their website. And I credit the EIR for helping to accomplish that. So I'm grateful to them for all the hard work they've done to do that. But I think the truth is coming out about Ukraine's corrupt and autocratic leader that Zelensky is not really a Democrat leader. He's much more of an autocrat and also very corrupt. Thank you.
Well, thank you, David. And on that last point you were making, one of Zelensky's recent actions was to move against the unionized workforce in Ukraine. 70% of union workers are going to be denied the right to collective bargaining. That certainly is an echo of what Hitler did in 1933. Our next speaker is Igor Lopatonok. He's a film director, and author. He was the author of the documentary Ukraine on Fire. And his title is Shut Down the Nazi Kill List. It is not just in Ukraine. Igor?
1, 2, 3. Hello, I'm Igor Lopatonok. I'm a filmmaker, director and producer. You probably see my films like Ukraine on Fire, Revealing Ukraine. Overall, I did 4 movies dedicated to Ukrainian crisis from 2014. Latest was released in 2021. I want to talk today about the policy of death list website, Mirotvorets, or Peacekeeper in English, and what was created in 2014 in Ukraine. As a proud member of that death list or kill list website, I want to touch base and explain what is going on in Ukraine with freedom of speech, what kind of regime Ukraine is now, and how they threaten it and trying to scare independent journalists, and how they try to make the narrative be located only in one field. First of all, when the coup d'etat happened in Ukraine in February and culminate in February 18 to February 20, 2014, that was already big help to moderate narrative. 3 TV channels was set up before that coup, Espresso and Gromadske and the Ukrstream, and they was jumping on the wagon of so-called revolution and immediately spread the narrative to the Ukrainian audience. They was financed from abroad. For example, we have records of the George Soros Foundation involved, and the Embassy of Netherlands and others. So this media attempt to moderate the narrative was from the beginning of coup succeed. They tried to go after all independent voices in the field, and that was initially 2014 with support of Anton Gerashchenko. This time the man was idea of famous leader of protest in Ukraine, Arsen Avakov, who later proceeded to be the chief of police in Ukraine or Minister of Internal Affairs. He is that guy, what I want to point out, very famous for different subject, what he did, but different policy. He was a godfather of Azov Battalion. He not formed Azov Battalion by himself, but he supported and legitimized Azov Battalion, giving them status of national guards in Ukraine. So practically acknowledging that this paramilitary formation of ruthless neo-Nazi ideology-aligned people, giving it completely legitimacy to be part of Ukrainian military. So this guy was a godfather of that famous peacekeeper or peacemaker website. What they actually do, they just try to, and they gather all data about the independent journalists, about writers, filmmakers, speakers. Initially, everybody who was in the eastern part of Ukraine, in the area what we know as a Donbass. But after that, they go after all Ukraine. And after all Ukraine, they go abroad. So they start targeting foreign journalists. They was famous to publish the personal data of more than 5,000 foreign journalists who was working in Donbass covering that conflict. What's actually, I believe, have all signs of civil war in Ukraine, more than the foreign intervention. So the Mirotvorets or Peacekeeper was criticized for doxing people, for publishing their personal data and geotargeting, geolocating people, journalists and others, and making that information very public. Second, after the first victim was killed, this is famous Ukrainian writer Oles Buzina. He was killed because of that website, and another parliament member of Ukraine was killed, and that's lead to consequences. First of all, Facebook banned the profile of Mirotvorets or Peacekeeper website on the Facebook, and after that they go after Azov. and they was ready to announce them terrorist organization, but suddenly everything changed. What's changed? The Mr. Biden team come back to the power, and after that we know that that website, kill list website, was famous to bragging about people who was killed, publishing and they pictures, big red writings, liquidated or terminated. They go about Daria Dugina, who was assassinated by Ukrainian, the suspected assassin was Ukrainian military woman called Natalia Vovk, and it was very lot of footprints on the snow left behind this. And after that, and after publishing on their website the data on Roger Waters and others, you know, they were so they overall it's like 600,000 names gathered on this website. A lot of people from Russia, a lot of people from media business in Russia or celebrities, because they're using technique, they want to publish in somebody very well known to bring attention to them. Who is advising them? This is a very good question, because then Anton Gerashchenko has no intellectual capacity to do something like that. But after the careful investigation of these things, we see the real professionals, so-called self-proclaimed informational influence operator, ex-United States military Colonel Joel Harding, and other activists who is abroad and who is sharing with Ukrainians technique and knowledge, technology and templates, how to go after people and how to organize that campaign to eliminate from the field voices what they don't want to hear, because that voices is very dangerous for their policies. They want to brainwash and manipulate Ukrainian society. Also, they want to brainwash and manipulate entire world society, especially Western world. They're quite successful in that. And everybody who is raising the voice against this mainstream narrative, they practically all agents of Putin or Putin apologists or working for Kremlin one way or another. So I'm on that website from 2019 for my film Revealing Ukraine. Also my executive producer and my interviewer who did a lot of help to make that movie happen, my dear friend Oliver Stone here. Also a lot of other people. I can include some very unique names like a Henry Kissinger or Mikhail Saakashvili. It's very strange to see dead people here, because they do like the totally opposite another side of barricade. But as I mentioned before, they put in celebrities on the list, they put in very well-known politician on the list because they want attention to them. I think this is a very dangerous example, what can lead to more consequences than we're experiencing right now. I believe that can lead to establishing such a kill list in the United States and targeting not now for Ukrainian crisis, for Ukrainian narrative, but for United States domestic narrative. And this is why we need to raise our voices, and we need to do everything to shut down that website, to expose everybody who is helping them, to expose all their wrongdoing, and to understand that our freedom of speech under ruthless attack from people whom we need to call by their names. And first name, what we need to use, we need to call them Nazi, because this is a tactic what Nazi Germany used during the World War II and before. And we're facing this reborn of Nazi Reich number 4, and now it's called Ukraine. Thank you. That's actually everything what I want to share. More you can find out in my films, Ukraine on Fire, Revealing Ukraine, The Everlasting Present, and Maidan Massacre. Thank you very much. It was Igor Lopatonok. filmmaker, producer, and director.
Igor, thank you for your comments. If you're just joining us, welcome to the Schiller Institute International Conference. The topic is Inspiring Humanity to Survive the Greatest Crisis in World History. And our second panel, which is going to continue, we have a few more speakers before we open for questions. The panel is Defend the Right to Deliberate. Now, our next speaker is an American journalist, Bradley Blankenship, and his topic is A Young U.S. Journalist's View of America's Criminal War Policy and the Attempt to Silence Me. Bradley?
Hey, everybody. Thanks a lot for this opportunity. I think what the Schiller Institute's what they're doing is really great, supporting us that are on the list. First, I'd like to talk a little bit about my perspective, because I think, no offense to the other people on the list, but I think I'm probably the youngest person there. And so my experience is a little bit different. And before Scott bull rushes me here, I have to say that, just being the age that I am and experiencing the things that I have, for example, I was born in Cincinnati, Ohio. I grew up in Northern Kentucky, which is basically the epidemic of the heroin and opiate crisis in the United States. The experience that I've had seeing how little the United States government cares about its citizens has inspired me to do all of the work that I do now, especially criticizing the policies of the US government. And because of that, because of what I've witnessed in my personal life, the destitution of people around me and so on, and also, discovering U.S. foreign policy later in life, this has all really driven me to a point where I can say that I don't feel like I'm a patriot, that I don't feel like I respect my country. And it's precisely because of lists like this that target people like me and people like Scott and others, people like Jeff. I think also I should note that this is not the first time that this has actually happened to me. Several years ago, at the height of the Syrian war, I was affiliated with a news agency called Al Masdar News Agency, and we were accused of being funded by Hezbollah, which many of you know is a U.S. designated terrorist organization. So that implied that we were somehow affiliated with the terrorist organization. And this accusation was leveled by an Israeli-backed group called Prop or Not, which was picked up by the Washington Post. It was on the international media after this. And I was personally accused of being funded by Hezbollah, which you can imagine, this is quite a heavy accusation. I was also affiliated with Telesur. I lived in Ecuador for a while, and the US-backed Lenin Moreno regime sanctioned our organization. We were unable to get paid, and the police were harassing us, in particular me, while I was an editor on duty at this building. We had armed guards there to protect us. You can imagine, as a person in your early 20s, that this is quite a scary situation. And shortly thereafter, I moved to Europe. I now live in the Czech Republic, where I have also been targeted for my views. For example, I have called out the fact that here in Prague, at one point, the Prague City Council tore down a statue to Ivan Konev, who is the Soviet general that liberated the Czech Republic from Nazi tyranny. They tore down the statue and shortly thereafter built a placard in Prague 6 that is dedicated to Nazi collaborators. I pointed this out in a column, and I was immediately targeted by the Czech media, Czech nationalists, anybody you can think of. I've been targeted by tabloids here, people trying to dig into my life. And shortly after the conflict, Russia's entry into the conflict in Ukraine, I had people show up to my house, a mob trying to attack me, and I had to call the police. This is not a joke. This is our lives. Particularly here in the Czech Republic and many other parts of the world that used to be part of the Warsaw Pact, there's laws in place, for example, in the Czech Republic, that you can actually be sent to prison for having pro-Russian views. And though I understand that this has not been implemented, so liberally, it is still something that can happen. And me, particularly being on this blacklist and a foreigner in this country, I'm at particular risk of this. So I just wanted to say that, especially addressing the question from the gentleman from TAS, that imprisonment is a form of political violence. And yes, I can totally imagine, and it is happening now. There are people here in the Czech Republic who have been prosecuted and sent to jail for having allegedly pro-Russian views. And depending on how far they're willing to take this, I could be one of those people. And in fact, I should note that I've been summoned to the Ministry of Interior next week. So in fact, I might be detained at that point. So this is something that I'm dealing with in my life. As far as why I was on the list, I think it's quite interesting. I was surprised to find myself on this list. So I should say that I'm a reporter for Xinhua News Agency here in the Czech Republic, a columnist at RT. as well as a columnist at CGTN and various other Chinese media outlets. The reason I was surprised to find myself on this list is for the reason that they described. For example, they said that the sanctions against Russia are not working, right? If you just happen to be a person living in the world today, that is so obvious. I mean, I live in Europe. I'm seeing the energy crisis here. I'm seeing, for example, we just had 70,000 people march in Wenceslaw Square in the center of Prague, opposed to their own government's policy and demanding the resignation of the Czech government because of their policies. They also said that I'm a Russian propagandist because I said that Ukraine is a hotbed for right-wing extremism. I was on a RT's crosstalk with Peter de Lavelle, and the day after that, I said this exact quote. The day after that was the Buffalo shooting. This is happening to people right now. And I also said, according to the list, that I believe that the world should negotiate with Putin, what they said, but negotiate with Russia. That is a principled pro-peace position. I mean, that is just, you know, if you care about Ukrainian life, Ukrainian infrastructure, the Ukrainian economy, you don't want this war to continue. And that's exactly what we're doing with our policies of arming and propping up the Zelensky government. That has nothing to do with being pro-Russia. And I will also note that on my column at RT, I explicitly said that I believe that the war is a violation of international law. So to describe me somehow as supporting the Russian state is absolutely ridiculous. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, Bradley, thank you for that. In Bradley's talk, he mentioned the targeting of him while he was reporting in Syria. Our next presentation is from Ava Bartlett, an American-Canadian journalist who's done very courageous reporting from both Syria and the Donbass. And she's been accused of being a Russian propagandist. So Ava?
Hi, my name is Eva Corrine Bartlett. I'm a Canadian and American citizen and journalist. I've been reporting from conflict zones since 2007 when I first went to occupied Palestine. In late 2008, I went to the Gaza Strip where I lived for a cumulative 3 years until March 2013, living there off and on. I was there during the 2008-2009 Israeli war on Gaza and also the 2012 Israeli war on Gaza. In April 2014, I started reporting from Syria, and I continued to go back to Syria, including last year, a cumulative, I believe it's 15 times now, sometimes for extended periods. And in September 2019, I first went to the Donetsk People's Republic in the Donbass and spent about 3 weeks there around the northern village of Gorlovka, visiting areas that were being shelled on a daily and nightly basis by the Ukrainian forces, and speaking with the mostly elderly who I met, residents that were being terrorized by the Ukrainian shelling, who had nowhere to go and had only the option of remaining there under the shelling, patching up their homes as best they could. It was truly an appalling situation. The administrator of the village of Zaitsevo described the Ukrainian shelling and deliberate attacks on homes as Ukraine taking out and destroying houses, house by house, street by street. And indeed, while I was there, I saw the smoldering remains of a house that had been shelled a day or two prior. After my 2019 visit, I wrote a lengthy article for Mint Press News detailing what I'd seen and heard and experienced. And at some point after that, I was placed on the notorious Ukrainian Mirotvorets kill list. Now, that didn't stop me from reporting. I continued to go to the Donbass this year, going in March with a delegation of other journalists, and then in April going back on my own, staying for a few weeks and doing so in subsequent months until mid-August when I left the Donbass. In reporting from both the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic, I've seen and heard many of Ukraine's atrocities and war crimes. For example, in one of my visits, Ukraine shelled a busy marketplace, killing 5 people. The bodies were still lying in the market when I visited. In, I believe it was June, Ukraine, in an intense bout of Ukrainian shelling of the center of Donetsk. Again, no military infrastructure there whatsoever, purely civilian infrastructure, purely Ukrainian terrorism of civilians. Ukraine bombed a maternity hospital. In late July, Ukraine began firing rockets containing the prohibited PETL or PFM-1 mines, raining them down on Donetsk and surrounding areas, including the very heart of Donetsk. These mines are incredibly difficult to spot, even when they've been indicated, and there's some sort of indicator around them. I myself saw many of them, but had a hard time picking them out visually. Obviously, I didn't get close enough for them to blow my hand or feet off, as they're designed to do. When I last saw an update over, it was nearly 60 civilians have had primarily feet, but also hands blown off by these prohibited mines. Ukraine signed the Ottawa Treaty, and its use of these mines is illegal. It is a war crime. So this is one of many war crimes I've documented in reporting from the Donbass. Canada unconditionally supports Ukraine. Canada has funded Ukraine up to $1 billion. Canada has trained Ukrainian soldiers, including Azov, and Canadians themselves have gone to fight in Ukraine. Now, if they didn't already have this Nazi ideology, certainly after being in Ukraine and indoctrinated by the Nazis there, Canadians returning to Canada will almost certainly have this ideology. Now, if I, as a journalist and a Canadian citizen, was to return to Canada, I have no idea what some of these Ukrainian nationalist type Canadians would do to me, but I'm certain the Canadian government would not protect me at all. Additionally, in July, Canada's state broadcaster and main propagandist, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, or CBC, ran a smear on me in which they basically depicted me, of course, as a Russian propagandist, not even discussing what I've reported on from the Donbass, and thereby whitewashing Ukraine's war crimes. CBC, in its report, instead focused on my participation in a war crimes tribunal in Moscow. The interesting thing about that, aside from the actually quite shoddy and pathetic smear of me, is that the CBC listed me as participating in that tribunal in April, when in fact it was March 11th. Where did the CBC get that information? Well, the only place they could have gotten that information is Ukraine's Mirotvorets smear list entry on me, which details my participation in that panel and incorrectly lists it as being in April. So I know for a fact that the CBC is aware of the kill list and is aware of my entry on it, but chose not to report on it. Some independent media reached out to me in late May and conducted an interview with me on my reporting from the Donbass and also on the Mirotvorets entry, and they concluded by saying they were going to contact major corporate media in Canada. Not a single corporate media entity has contacted me about that kill list. On August 4th, when I was in Donetsk, Ukraine was bombing the very center of the city heavily. The first 3 bombs were about 200 meters away from the hotel I was staying in. The 4th and 5th landed 50 meters away and then exactly next to the hotel. It may have been coincidental that Ukraine bombed a hotel full of journalists, or it may not, because it was well known that journalists stayed there. 4 days prior, Louise Mensch had tweeted at Ukrainian Special Forces that I was in the Donbass. The tone of her tweet was effectively to liquidate me, as the Mirotvorets folks like to say. Returning to the issue of Mirotvorets, it's absolutely appalling that a database like this exists, openly calling for the murders of people like myself, yourselves, 327 children, simply because we are speaking about Ukraine's war crimes and we're speaking about the corruption within Ukraine. This list presents a very real threat to Ukrainians themselves, not only to journalists and to people who are speaking up, but to Ukrainians within Ukraine proper. Many of these Ukrainians have already been disappeared or killed. As I said before, none of this will stop me from reporting, and I'm preparing to return to the Donbass in the near future. But the Mirotvorets list should not exist. We must do everything we can to have it removed and hold those behind it and those who are tacitly supporting it accountable for terrorism.
Eva, thank you for that report and for your courage in continuing to expose the corruption and the murderous assault conducted against the people of Donbass. We will be taking questions after the next speaker. If you have questions, send them to questions@schillerinstitute.org. Our next speaker is Mira Terada. She is the head of an organization called the Foundation to Battle Injustice. They had a press conference just recently in Moscow, which included a number of journalists and others who have been put on these hit lists. And she has an initiative to demand, her organization does, to demand that the United Nations act to defend journalists from the illegal actions of Mirotvorets, and she'll be telling us about that initiative. Mira?
Hello, everyone. I would love to thank Schiller Institute and the Executive Intelligence Review for this event and the opportunity to participate and contribute in it. The Ukrainian nationalist resource Mirotvorets, which is de facto legalized terrorist organization in Ukraine and created on the initiative of a former freelance advisor to the Minister of Internal Affairs of Ukraine, collects and publishes in its database persons allegedly involved in anti-Ukrainian actions or words. Personal data is obtained illegally, published without permission, and exposes people's lives and safety to a real threat. The administration of the site, which has proclaimed itself a group of specialists, publicate photos, residential addresses, document numbers, and other personal data of everyone who comes into the field of view of the Mirotvorets. As the head of the human rights organization Foundation to Battle Injustice, I have been working for several months to close this resource and recognize it as a terrorist organization. This is the reason why my personal data was also published on Mirotvorets database. The Foundation's human rights defenders analyzed the data posted on Mirotvorets, on the basis of which we held 2 press conferences in Moscow, the main purpose of which was to attract the attention of the world community to the illegal publications of personal data of underage children and journalists. Moreover, the human rights defenders of the Foundation to Battle Injustice have transferred the collected materials to the United Nations through the first deputy permanent representative of the Russian Federation to the UN, Dmitry Polyansky, and to the UN Children's Fund, UNICEF. I also would like to inform you that the Foundation to Battle Injustice submitted documents to the Federal Security Service of Russia to investigate the activities of the Mirotvorets website and recognize those involved in the creation of this resource as a terrorist organization. According to the materials collected by the human rights defenders of the Foundation to Battle Injustice, the Ukrainian nationalist resource contains personal data of at least 327 minors, including their residential addresses, links to social media pages, contact numbers, and photos. The youngest of the children in the Mirotvorets database is not even 10 years old. A girl born in 2012 was published on the database because of participation in an action dedicated to the 76th anniversary of a victory in World War II on May 9, 2021 in the city of Gorlovka, Donetsk People's Republic. Another 9-year-old from Russia was listed on the Mirotvorets website only because her parents posted a video of their summer vacation on the territory of Crimea on the internet. Many children received threats, including physical violence, after the publication of personal data on the Ukrainian website Mirotvorets. In addition to the personal data of minors, Mirotvorets contains the data of journalists from Russia and the world. During the analysis of the Foundation to Battle Injustice, we came to the conclusion that the database of the Ukrainian nationalist resource contains the personal data of at least 341 journalists from 31 countries of the world. The targets for the administrators of the Ukrainian website are media employees who were accredited in DPR and LPR, visited those republics and Crimea, and also expressed a point of view that differs from the official position of Kiev. In order to give at least a faint illusion of legality to their actions, the administrators of the Mirotvorets put forward serious accusations of crimes against Ukraine to journalists. Many journalists who became victims of the criminal activities of Mirotvorets reported that after the publication of their personal information on the site, they began to receive threats. Ukrainian journalist Ales Buzina, who was mentioned before, who was killed in Kiev in 2014, shortly before his death, said that he received threats referring to the Mirotvorets database. A total of 12 journalists from the Mirotvorets list died violently, most of whom were Russian citizens, including Daria Dugina, whose personal data was posted on Peacemaker a month and a half before her death. The publication by Ukrainian nationalists not only violates a number of international agreements and laws, but also endangers the life and safety of everyone who found themselves on the Mirotvorets firing list. The Foundation to Battle Injustice prepared an open letter to the UN, which has already been signed by many. Today, I ask all participants and viewers of this conference to sign the letter. I have sent the letter to the Schiller Institute and Executive Intelligence Review, so they have it. I believe it will be sent to you as well. Please sign it. And next week, we will have an online petition put up on our website as well. Website address is fondfbr.ru. Again, fondfbr.ru. As the head of the Foundation to Battle Injustice, I'm convinced that only through the joint efforts of human rights organizations, law enforcement agencies, and international intergovernmental organizations, it's possible to achieve complete blocking of the Mirotvorets resource and complete deletion of personal data collected and posted illegally. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mira. And we do have your letter, and we will make that available to anyone who wants it to sign it and send it in. It's on the Schiller Institute, or it will be on the Schiller Institute website. So thank you for joining us, and thank you for your press conference last week, which was very important. So this concludes our panel presentations from the second panel. And now we can take some questions. But before we take the questions, I just want to go to Diane and ask her if she has any comments on what she's heard and if she'd like to say something before we get into the questions from the viewers. You're muted, Diane.
Thank you. I sure was. Well, thank you for that. And I'd like to thank everyone for their courage, because it does take courage to tell the truth. Although if people are honest, they might realize that we should be more afraid of the implications of not telling the truth in a situation like this. I would like to really underscore the urgency of shutting down these lists, shutting down the Mirotvorets organization, frankly, as a whole, not because that per se will solve all the problems, or that's the biggest problem, but we have a situation which has been ongoing for some time. In the United States, you can date it perhaps most sharply to the 9/11 attacks, where we have a kind of totalitarian world where people have lost their sense of justice and where they feel certain kinds of activity are normal that would never have been seen as normal. And I myself experienced this. I was speaking, this is now 10 years ago, at a university where I asked the students, do you think it's legal for one government to invade another country and overthrow their government? And about half of the people in the class didn't see a problem with that. They didn't know that this was a violation of international law or some kind of principle. So I think a fight in this area, and Ray McGovern, I think, made a similar point in the first panel, that there are certain areas where you must take a stand, even as we fight for the big picture, for an entirely new system, which I think we have an opportunity to create right now. But there are certain fights which are crucial to reverse, because it will help to restore a legitimate sense of justice in the population as a whole, and particularly in younger generations where it's really urgently needed.
Okay, thank you, Diane. I'm trying to find out if there are any other people from the panel who are on to take questions. If so, could they be brought up right now so I can see? Because we do have some questions, and there are more coming in. If you have a question, send it in to questions@schillerinstitute.org. Jose, is there anyone else? Is just going to be Diane and me?
No.
Okay. Gretchen, good. And David, thanks for joining us and staying with us. All right. First, we have something from Ruben Guzzetti, who writes for the daily Tiempo Argentina He's also the director of the Argentine Institute of Geopolitical Studies, and he wanted to say something about the attack last week, the attempted assassination of Cristina Fernandez, the vice president of Argentina. Ruben, go ahead.
Hola, buenas tardes a todas y todos.
Hello, good afternoon to all. First of all, I'm speaking to you from Buenos Aires, Argentina, and I want to thank the Schiller Institute for this initiative to organize this seminar. I was not able to participate this morning because I was at a very important meeting, which was occurring here in the center of Buenos Aires, which was sponsored and organized by the Argentine government and the Chinese embassy in Argentina to launch the likely inclusion of Argentina along with all of the members of the BRICS countries. It's not going to be BRICS. It's going to be BRICS Plus, because not only Argentina will be joining, but there are other countries that have also requested to join this organization. I'm saying this because I think that it's very closely connected to the issue which we're raising today, which is that there's another world that's being constructed against this entire debacle which we are living through of the globalized international financial system, and that is directly connected to the government of the United States and of the United Kingdom, and which is creating this lunacy internationally which we're living through. There were very alarming statements made by Mr. Grossi, the head of the IAEA. He said it's very, very worrisome that the bombardment, the artillery strikes are continuing against the Zaporizhia nuclear plant because of the great risk that this poses to have some sort of radioactive leaks. And this could affect a very large part of the European population. Having said that, I would like to mention what we've lived through here in our country over the last few days, the extremely serious attack against the Vice President Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner. Fortunately, we don't know really why or how, but the shots that were fired did not actually come out of the gun, but which, had it happened, this clearly would have sunk our country into an outright civil war. So I'm saying this is an extremely grave matter. So we don't know for sure if this was related or not to the entire theme which is being discussed today and in the seminar. But what we do know, and it's been said here, that there are international people who are promoting these kinds of activities. I don't think it's accidental that in recent years there have been assassinations of great importance. I'm recalling other assassinations. The assassination of Moise in Haiti, the murder in recent days of Daria Dugina. That is to say, there may be different motives for those different assassinations, but clearly the activities of the Center to Counter Disinformation, the CCD, is a body which stimulates these kinds of attacks. So, having said this, I would like to once again express my appreciation for what the Schiller Institute is doing to be able to take on and stop these absolutely illegal activities, these violent activities, which take us back to very dramatic earlier times that humanity has lived through. To not take more of your time, I would like to ask a question or two. I would like to ask Diane Sare a question. Hopefully the upcoming senator for New York. people of different organizations for many years here in Argentina have been concerned and try to be involved in, given our possibilities, to investigate the state of affairs inside the United States. Also Great Britain, but especially I want to ask about the United States, your country, because we view this as something which is of fundamental importance. What is happening there in US society to be able to find a way out, to have a world of greater solidarity and possibilities for development and so on and so forth, as we've been talking. So I would like to know how she views the evolution of this correlation of forces in the United States. And another question for Bradley Blankenship. I'm sorry if I got his name wrong, but I do believe that within that, this call, these developments going on inside society, I think there's a fundamental aspect that is needed to be able to move forward, and that is, so I would like, that is the issue of the question of youth. And I would like him to talk to us a little bit about what is going on with youth. What are the possibilities of youth, that these sector of society take up the banner of the defense of rights to solve the problems of an unjust world. So those are my questions. And I would like to say to Bradley that here, with great friendship, that there are many youth here. And so I send you a big abrazo, big embrace, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Ruben. Unfortunately, Bradley is not with us, so maybe the youngest person we have is Diane, and she could say something on that in response to the first question as well. And I think this is a question that many people have, which is, how do you change the situation in the United States, and how do you see it? So, Diane, why don't you start with that? And I'd also combine that with another question that has come from a number of people, which is, how do we break this media censorship in the Western world about this kind of operation going on in Ukraine, the assassinations, the threats, and so on. So let's start with the first one, Diane, for you, and then David and Gretchen will come to you.
Okay, good. I actually want to go back to something that our friend said a little bit earlier in his comments on what happened with the vice president of Argentina, because in a sense, the relationship between these various assassinations is not necessarily going to be direct among the assassins, even though many of them seem to be wearing the Black Sun and various insignia shared by the Azov battalion, but really a commitment to destroy the principle of the sovereign nation state and the potential of this new order of coming into being. And from that standpoint, the origin is not Ukraine. Ukraine is not Ukraine, just as the Nazi is not Nazi. We know from Hitler before that he was funded by people like Prescott Bush, Brown Brothers Harriman, the Bank of England, for various geopolitical purposes. And you know very well that the current regime in Ukraine would never do anything on its own. In fact, they tried to negotiate an end to this war and really were not allowed to do so. And so, having said that, this is why it's so important that we get a change from the United States. I can say that actually I've had an opportunity to interact with a growing number of younger people through my campaign. I mean, people in their 20s. And I'm pleased to report that there are many, many young people who actually are profoundly concerned about what's happening in the world, who are, as I was when I was young, very concerned about what is happening to people in the poorest countries, the most victimized members of society, whether it's Yemen or Afghanistan. And we are working to pull many of these people together, particularly also around my campaign in New York, which is an important campaign nationally and internationally because of what Schumer represents as the majority leader in the US Senate. He is the enforcer, he is the person to ram through many of the most hideous and horrible policies that the United States has recently adopted, not the least of which is this continuing to send more and more billions of dollars worth of weaponry to this Nazi and totalitarian regime in Ukraine. In terms of the blackout, that is a big challenge. That's something that I'm trying to figure out here because in the state of New York, as people may or may not be aware, there was new legislation passed actually in the budget, but dealing with elections, which said that the state doesn't want to waste money on giving matching funds. And as a federal candidate, I'm not eligible for matching funds at any rate, but they don't want anyone that doesn't share the majority view, who's not either a Republican or Democrat, to be given ballot access. I mean, imagine being that blatant to say we don't want anyone we disagree with to be on the ballot. How do you ever get a change in policy? So I was confronted with a tripling of the signature requirement. Normally it's 15,000 signatures in a statewide race. For a non-major party affiliated candidate, it was 45,000. It had never been done before in history. We submitted 66,000 signatures for my campaign. By the definition of these political pundits and their courts, that should make me a major viable candidate who should be covered and who should be invited to the debates. And as Harley said earlier, there are only 3 candidates on the ballot, myself, Schumer, and a Republican nominee. And they are very determined to not mention me, including the fact that the New York Times called and had a lengthy discussion with my campaign manager about this ballot access question, and then turned around and wrote an article about why there's only 2 candidates for governor, never once mentioning that I had succeeded. So, but nonetheless, the truth is seeping out. First of all, these giant media conglomerates like CNN or the New York Times have greatly lost credibility. People don't believe them anymore. People aren't watching them anymore. I've been pleasantly surprised to find myself speaking to Puerto Rican young people in a gym in the Bronx, where I say Nazi in Ukraine, and they say, oh yes, we know, the Azov battalion. People are very familiar with this. The bad thing about the media is it creates a kind of conformist culture where people may not be honest about what they think. So you get a sense that the brainwashing has been perhaps more penetrating than it is. And you'll discover if you stand up and say the truth, or you say the thing that you think will be controversial, actually many, many people are already aware of it, but they didn't quite have the courage to be the first one to say it. So I think we're making good progress. It's not nearly enough. Helga stressed that we have to fight. The victory is possible, but we have to fight. I emphatically agree with that.
Okay, let's go to the second part of that question, which is how do you break the control, the censorship in the U.S. media? David, I'll start with you, and then Gretchen, I'd like your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think that it's extremely difficult because, as everyone is aware here, we have mostly almost a communist Chinese controlled liberal mainstream media that really tries to censor out any forms of dissent, such as ours, or viewpoints of peace with Russia, which is ironic because, of course, China and Russia are close military allies. But that is probably the one thing that the liberal media is willing to dissent from communist China on is being anti-Russian. And of course, this all started with the Trump impeachment back in 2019, in which Trump was actually impeached essentially for refusing to start World War III with Russia. And it's very, very strange that the Democrats and now many neoconservative Republicans have formed this unholy alliance to try to start a war with Russia. And of course, we know that that's Ukrainian President Zelensky's primary aim, is to enmesh the United States and NATO in a world war with Russia. And of course, from a U.S. national security perspective, myself as an America First foreign policy analyst, I see the primary and the vital national security interest of the United States is to avert a world war with Russia and China, and to pursue policies that President Nixon advocated of peaceful accommodation with Russia and China, in which we would only provide reciprocal concessions, that is, only granting concessions to Moscow and Beijing when they provide concessions as well. And it's very sad that the Biden administration has chosen to break off essentially all diplomatic, high-level diplomatic negotiations, which, had they chosen to, could have ended this war on favorable terms for Ukraine back in April, as was mentioned. Both UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson and the Biden administration joined together to sabotage and to undo what appeared to be a tentative peace deal that would end the war in Ukraine between Russia and Ukraine. So it is a huge concern. We know that the Ukraine is willing and has a record of assassinating dozens of political opponents, particularly Ukrainian leaders, members of the Ukrainian parliament, the Rada. They've assassinated a number of Ukrainian leaders simply for advocating a peaceful negotiated compromise agreement ending the war and the death and destruction in Ukraine, such as I was have advocated and for which I was put on the Ukrainian blacklist. So it is a huge problem to try to break through the liberal media cabal and to propose America First realist solutions that promote peace in the interests of not only the United States but the entire world. But we have to keep fighting. Certainly on Fox News, we have a voice to reason on in terms of the Tucker Carlson show. He's had Colonel Douglas McGregor just on very recently, last night, proposing peace with Russia as well. So we have to find a way to promote all of those viewpoints and to unite together in a bipartisan coalition with voices on the left and on the right, both here in the United States and internationally. Thank you.
Gretchen, given that the work of the Executive Intelligence Review that you reported is now available, isn't this something that could be used widely to awaken a movement toward the Congress to cut off the funding?
Absolutely. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. Absolutely. One thing I wanted to say on that front, I think the very fact that the Schiller Institute, Helga Zepp-LaRouche personally, and you, Harley, and Diane, and many speakers who joined our platform in these discussions that we had, show that we were included on a CCD blacklist, which is run basically by the NATO combination, shows exactly how we can break down the this media. Because for many years, hold on one second here, I just want to do something. There you go. For many years, we have, there's been a policy, as a matter of fact, a stated policy since 1976, that no one in the liberal media was ever supposed to mention Lyndon LaRouche, his movement, fact that he was running for president, the fact that he gave I think it was maybe 13 actual national half-hour television shows, which were seen on CBS, ABC, and NBC, and seen by millions of Americans, and no one was supposed to mention it, talk about it, whatever, because anytime you mention him, you give him credibility, and he's supposed to be a non-existent person, and his movement a non-existent movement. So why would suddenly the Schiller Institute be singled out as it was? David, you're included for work you've done. There are many people on that list who have done, has spoken out in a very brave and courageous way. But, people were on that list. A farmer from Kansas, because they had been associated with the Schiller Institute. Now, that's very interesting because the only reason that we were able to force them to have to attack us is because we're being successful. And the method by which we've been successful is that under Helga's direction, the Schiller Institute has been organizing for 2.5 years, but really particularly this year since February, not just since the spectacular April 9th conference, which if people haven't seen, I think they should go back and look to. Discussions about people, Americans, Europeans, Chinese, Indians, South Africans, other Africans, Latin Americans, Russians, to come together and discuss how can we put the world together. And that was based on the basic tenet of this movement, which Lyndon LaRouche was very clear on, which is ideas are what make history. And if you have the right idea, if you have an idea that matches the historical and natural law requirements for humanity at the time, you can be blacked out as Lyndon LaRouche was blacked out. You can be jailed as he was jailed. You can be all these things that have happened. And your idea, if understood, as there were several people in the morning panel, the Russian economists, the Chinese economists, who reported, for example, that that Russia and China are, by studying LaRouche's ideas, actually changed the entire direction of where they're going. Their nations are going. Now, that's not a small statement, if you want to think about that one, right? And so that where the Schiller Institute has proven that when people come together and around these conferences and now around this fight to shut down the CCD, we are demonstrating that the unifying of forces against this is extremely powerful and is I think the thing that the enemy the global NATO most fears, not to mention a candidate for Senate in New York, but as part of this process. So we have to stick to it. People have to forget the media. I think it's interesting that on Wednesday, we held a fantastic press conference. The EIR organized a fantastic press conference of people on the list speaking out from all these different perspectives and unified. There was a lot of ideas thrown around there about what to do next, how to get Congress to shut down this operation, what we do if Congress doesn't respond to what's needed, what other ideas we can do. So you got this sense of, wow, this is moving. The next day, the Washington Post publishes a report which goes through the fact that Ukraine has a hit list. Has a blacklist, has a unit, various paramilitary units, and a policy of assassinating collaborationists. Now, they discussed only Ukraine in that case. But they did mention, for example, that the Interior Ministry's SBU has a unit, a special unit, assigned to liquidate collaborationists. That's the kind of thing. We create an environment, we put so much up that they have to begin to admitting part, putting things out. Now, just to mention, Executive Intelligence Review's investigative task force has not finished its work. We are proceeding. We're investigating a whole lot of different things, and there's more we can say later in the conversation about that. But I think we have to stick to what we're doing, and we can get the breakout we need, because the other advantage that we have is by operating internationally. you can reverberate things. And as I think it was someone said here, and it might have been Diane, courage begets courage. So we've got kicked up a lot, and I think we should stick to it. The one thing I wanted to come back to in answer to Ruben Gussetti's question on the Argentine question, what he reported about where he was this morning at a meeting to discuss the entry of Argentina in the BRICS is very important in terms of understanding why would any agency, someone, be interested in assassinating Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner. You have to remember, magnicides of that level carry a cost, because if someone assassinates a president, it takes a Warren Commission to cover that up. It takes a huge mobilization. So you don't take that, no agency takes that decision lightly. But it does win, and has done that historically, when there is an urgent need. Argentina, on the 6th of September, officially filed the request to join the BRICS Association. And in doing so, it was what happened was the ambassador of Argentina to China, a fellow named Vaca Narvaja, presented a letter at an international meeting where a forum where China and the BRICS were being discussed, presented it to a letter from President Alberto Fernandez of Argentina addressed to President Xi Jinping, which would be passed on, which would contain the formal request. In reporting and announcing that that letter had been delivered, Vaca Navarra, the ambassador, made some very strong statements that indicate what's at stake here, because he was discussing the BRICS and the BRICS New Development Bank, and he called it that bank the institutionalization of a new world order, the real alternative to the Atlantic system of global financial governance, which has created so many problems for all emerging countries, a decisive step towards creating a new financial architecture based on production and development. So the Argentina joined the BRICS. Argentina is in a desperate financial situation right now for the reasons every country is in one, and with particular attention because they're saddled with an illegal IMF debt of, I think it's 45 billion. I could be a little off. It's in that range. Put on unconstitutionally by the previous administration. So the situation is very desperate. In the middle of that, not 2 weeks before the attempt on Cristina Fernandez's life, the U.S. ambassador, Mark Stanley, went to a public meeting of the Council of the Americas and the Americas Society. Now, has been since its founding in the early 60s. Basically, that's where the cartel and Wall Street interests control what's called the business interests of the United States towards Ibero-America, south of the border. And he went before it, and before he spoke, the mayor of Buenos Aires, who is anti-Cristina, hard, anti-Russia, anti-China, pro-IMF, pro-finance, that he had said, look, we've got to have a coalition come out of the next elections in 23 of the opposition and, decent sectors, I suppose, in this government that he considered, but to put the program through. And the U.S. ambassador stood up and said, no, I think we need that coalition now. And he said that if there is the right policy in Argentina, then you've got all these interests and U.S. interests who are planning to go in for your lithium, your oil, your gas, your infrastructure, your this, your that, and the other. Now, there's no conceivable way there could be a coalition government with the vice president being Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, because as she is very close to the China policy, very close to the Russia policy. She's an active voice within the administration, very strong voice for the BRICS perspective. So I just mentioned that. I'm not saying that that's a real consideration in terms of considering what the context was created in which such a thing could happen, which is, as Mr. Gussetti said, was extremely dangerous. And just to finish up, and then we'll go on. But I think what the Russian embassy in Washington said 2 or 3 days after the attempted assassination is very relevant to the discussion of the relationship between the CCD list, the Buffalo shooting, and the assassination with Christina and other such actions. And because it said, look, the State Department issued a statement, oh, they were very upset, and, I'm sure somebody was, about the attempted assassination on Christina by this fellow, but no one mentioned that he was covered with tattoos of the Azov Battalion. That the State Department has not mentioned, no official. And so what the Russian embassy raised the question, how many more people around the world must be affected by the actions of Nazi ideology supporters before the United States realizes its danger and stops condoning the Ukrainian nationalist crimes? That is exactly what the U.S. is doing in Ukraine, where the Kiev regime fighters continue to intentionally exterminate the civilian population. And the population of Buffalo felt the effects of that spread of that ideology. That's it.
Okay, that leads me right into the next question, which I think Diane should get a crack at it first. But someone wrote in about the Biden speech about his bizarre attack on the MAGA movement in the United States, talking about extremists, terrorists, threats coming from them, threats of terror. Now, the irony, of course, is that here you have Biden calling people semi-fascists. Who's providing arms to the fascists in Ukraine? That's Biden. So there's certainly a disconnect there. But the question was more specific. It was about the Ukrainian immigrants who have come to the United States. And Scott Ritter brought this up in the discussion with you recently, Diane, about your security and his security, that you have these immigrant populations who could be part of the Azov or right sector. Ava Bartlett mentioned the same thing regarding Canada. So I just like your thoughts about this, especially given the role that Schumer has played in promoting the support for the Ukrainian government and its Nazi units.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, there is a Ukrainian youth camp only about an hour from my office, which I don't think was founded by recent immigrants. It's been there for some time because, as people may be aware, after World War II, we really did not seek to eradicate this ideology. And I'm not proposing dictatorial thought police methods, but simply airing, AIRING, the truth about the philosophy of the Nazis, what happened at Nuremberg, why were key people allowed to escape. I'm beginning to think of having a campaign slogan: before there was Schumer, there was Schacht, because that's really what you're dealing with. And there probably is certainly a danger from some, as Scott Ritter put it, once you're on this list or one of these lists, what does it take for some hothead to just say, oh, I'm going to do a service for Zelensky or whatever, Ukrainian nationalism, the great white master race, and I'm going to bump off this person or whatever. That's true. That's a threat. That's why I'm saying this really has to be shut down. And we have to establish in the American identity a higher principle of truth. We saw this as soon as Donald Trump came into office, where people were holding up a severed head of his in effigy, and that wasn't considered a death threat. Whether people thought they supported President Trump or not, there's a certain respect that you would have for the office that you wouldn't hold demonstrations that appear to be advocating direct physical violence against a head of state. Also, on this fascist question, I do want to bring up here, because it's come to my attention, as people may or may not be aware of, you mentioned, Harley, the attack on labor unions' collective bargaining rights. There's also a fight which is actually ongoing over the political parties in Ukraine, where they've attempted to ban, I think it may be up to 13 parties. And there are actually hearings being held in the Supreme Court of Ukraine where observers can go, people can call in. I think this would be quite interesting and frankly fun to put a little pressure on them to let them know that people are watching how they handle their rationale for outlawing all opposition. Maybe this would be a good lesson for members of the state assembly in the state of New York. But back to what I said earlier, I think this question of a higher principle is really urgent, because if you fall into something lower, then you are a victim of this divisiveness, as what we saw in Biden's speech, saying that basically 50% of the voters in this nation are somehow traitors. And I will say that this has also been used in Washington, D.C. to limit the ability of people to access their representative governments. Years ago, when I was working with Mr. LaRouche and other slightly younger organizers, we would be up on Capitol Hill trying to get Glass-Steagall reinstated, or trying to do something on retooling the auto sector, or various matters. And you'd run around on the Hill and you'd see busloads of farmers, and you would see the Catholic charities, or you'd see, on the negative side, you'd see groups of Saudi sheiks coming in. But, you know, people would go, you got a sense there was sort of a flow of ideas where you had, at least in some way, access to the person who is called your representative. Now, all of that is shut down. You cannot go to see your Congress. You can't walk the halls of Congress. You can only get into the building if you can prove that you have an appointment with a particular office. And anyone who has tried to make an appointment with some of these House and Senate offices has an idea that this is not, it should be straightforward. It is not the most straightforward thing. They tell you call in, and then they say you have to send an email to someone, and then maybe they respond. It's ridiculous. Now, happily, we can still get to local offices, and everybody should be doing that. The staff of your representatives should know your name, your face. You should be there. You should be on the case all the time. But the idea of the President of the United States lecturing about this, and then we have a situation where Washington, D.C. has become sort of an impenetrable fortress, is, I would say, worse than hypocritical.
Okay, David, I have a question for you from one of our friends, Bernie from London, who asks about the Department of Homeland Security. He said it was obviously set up after 9/11. It's clear that the National Security Agency has been conducting widespread spying on Americans. And I think he's making the connection to the fact that U.S. intelligence operatives are present at some of these CCD meetings in Kiev, NATO officials and others. And what can be done about this? And he basically asks, is there a reason to keep the Department of Homeland Security, given the way it's functioning, as something to spy on Americans, and to relate that to what you know about the CCD operations in Ukraine to silence free speech?
I think that's a great question, and that's it's something I've called for. I've been calling for several months now, at least, if not over a year. We need to abolish the Department of Homeland Security. It's being weaponized by the Biden administration, or the Biden regime, as I call it, against 74 million Trump voters, against a former president of the United States, and it's very un-American that they're using all of these the Patriot Act type tools that were really designed to fight terrorists against so-called domestic terrorists here at home in our country, here in America. And it is a very fascistic tendency that we've seen by the Biden regime, apparently copying what we're seeing in Ukraine. In Ukraine, as was mentioned, the Zelensky regime is assassinating political opponents, anyone in favor of peace with Russia and end to the war, which they'd like to continue fighting for years on end in order to solidify their de facto alliance with NATO and to potentially increase NATO's military presence in Ukraine with hundreds of troops and CIA agents. And in terms of prosecuting and imprisoning political opponents, which we've seen, including two presidential rivals until the war began. He was going after Poroshenko and Timoshenko as well, who were his two top rivals in the last election, believed to be in the next Ukrainian presidential election as well. And Zelensky also outlawed 11 to 13 opposition parties, and has forced all Ukrainian TV networks to broadcast Ukrainian government propaganda 24/7. It's as if after Trump won the election, he threw Hillary and Obama in prison and forced CNN and MSNBC to broadcast Fox News at all hours of the day. So, and worse yet, of course, the assassinations. Thankfully, we haven't seen that yet with the Biden regime here in the United States, but that could be the next step. So we need to stay on alert against that. But in terms of what we can do, we have to really, again, unite the left and right, everyone concerned with civil liberties here in the United States, everyone who's opposed to censorship, and opposes spying and the persecution of people based on purely political reasons or what I call thought crimes. We can't allow the criminalization of thought here in the United States. That's in opposition to the First Amendment of the Constitution. And what we need to do is we need to make this a big issue by calling our members of Congress and urging them to take action. Some of the leaders in that regard opposing those types of tools being used against Americans include Senator Rand Paul, of course, who's on the CCD hit list, as well as Senator Mike Lee here in Utah. But I wanted to also talk about, there's a very strange fusion of kind of Soviet and neo-Nazi tendencies within the Zelensky regime. On the one hand, there's the clear neo-Nazi element of the Azov Regiment and affiliated organizations, both paramilitary and political. And the U.S., of course, is arming these neo-Nazi organizations and really, totally contradicts the theme of the Biden administration, which is to oppose white supremacism and to also oppose, kind of neo-Nazi elements, which they accuse the Republican opposition of having. And I also find it very interesting that for an administration like the Biden administration, which claims to focus on the importance of minority rights, here they are focusing on the deaths of admittedly very tragic deaths of 5,600 Ukrainian civilians in Russia, calling it genocide, but ignoring Chinese genocide against their own people. The Uyghurs, of course, millions of Chinese political and religious dissidents, as well as in the past, hundreds of thousands of Black Africans that have been killed. And it does kind of seem like the Biden administration has kind of a white-centric racist policy. And that's just for appearance's sake. I'm not saying that they are racist themselves, but it's also I also think it's worth pointing out that there are only 32 countries that are supporting the sanctions regime against Russia, whereas 84% of the countries of the world are either pro-Russian, as in the case of China or India, or neutral, as in the case of most of the global South. In terms of the Ukrainian death toll, the Zelensky regime has claimed perhaps 25,000 to 30,000 Ukrainian deaths, whereas the UN Human Rights Commission has stated it's closer to 5,600, which I believe is probably more reputable, given that they're nonpartisan and don't have really a stake and are quite neutral in the war between Russia and China. But what I find interesting is during World War II, I'm a World War II historian myself, and during World War II, we killed an average of 2,063 German and Japanese civilians a day in terms of the US and UK. And so in 3 days, we've exceeded the Russian death toll in Ukraine in terms of Ukrainian civilians. And we're calling it genocide, what they've done in over 6 months. So there is what I would say is, a lot of hypocrisy in calling what Russia has done war crimes, but refusing to admit our own war crimes in our distant past during World War II. Thank you.
I just want to refer to the fact that in January 2001, Lyndon LaRouche did a webcast, and he warned of a potential Reichstag fire type event in the months ahead because of the Bush administration's inability to deal with the economic crisis. And of course, he said that would be the excuse for an emergency decree. And that was another case where LaRouche made a forecast that was absolutely right. And had people listened to him, perhaps we could have avoided 9/11, as Bill Binney and Kurt Wiebe and others have said. The NSA was incompetent in the handling they had of intelligence. Now, I want to get to, I guess, Gretchen, this is for you. There's someone who wrote in and said, has there been any evidence of censorship or suppression of people on this blacklist? We've covered it in general terms, but I think you have some specifics on that, besides, of course, the Dugina case.
Oh, you mean the Mirovoritz grouping?
Yeah.
I don't have the profile in front of me, but the question is, has it been international? Because because in Ukraine it's numerous, and I don't have it in front of me. I can't list it. We've reported on some of it. We'll do some more of it, but it's probably hundreds, if not thousands. And certainly dozens of known specific leading figures on the list, then killed. In terms of what they hit internationally, the effects of the suppression, I believe Scott Ritter on Wednesday gave just being named on the CCD list has gotten his 2 publications that's it. They can't let him write for them anymore because he's named as a Kremlin propagandist. In terms of assassinations internationally, I am not aware of any now. I think that was an issue in the press conference also. I think it's a very live threat. And I think Senator Kane's statement, there's no threat to American lives on this, is completely wrong. And I think Diane made reference to that. And Scott Ritter has made reference to that. There is, and that's what I was referencing in terms of the Christina and the Buffalo case. This is a very easy thing to launch if they want, through the way it's done in the United States is usually the lone assassin, the nut, a little bit like what they're trying to portray the attack on Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner in Buenos Aires. They say, oh, it was just, he was a degenerate, that's fine, but obviously there was a strategic intent behind it, and therefore a more important strategic network behind it. And I think one of the things I would refer people to is an article that Scott Ritter wrote, I believe, on a Consortium News about a week or 2 ago, where he went through the awful Stepan Bandera ideology and the relationship of that to his own personal security, and also of that of, for example, Diane Sare and others on that list. I think it has to be taken very, very seriously, just because it doesn't have to, that if you look at who the CCD is and the foreign control of it and the degree of NATO control over it, for example, it's not just State Department funding. I believe it was Jim Jatras who mentioned here that something like this could not have been done. And Igor also mentioned this can't have been done without a higher control agency in it. That is what we have to watch out for and prevent. One thing I just want to make the point, look, we know the Assange case, we know what they've done. Generally, what they've attempted to do, this is like we're dealing with an incredibly advanced censorship operation internationally, particularly in the west of the world. Why would this be so important to knock out the CCD? It's the principle that that hunters use, which Lyndon LaRouche always used to talk about. If you're going to out hunting and you see a flock of ducks, you don't shoot it all and you go for the lead duck. And if you get the lead duck, then you have access to the whole operation. The CCD, we have caught them. If they are related to the Morovets list, and that we called out, and that is known, and we will be publishing more on the UN investigations and the French report. I mean, this thing is known. So it's not no one that you cannot say did not know. You do know, people do know, and we'll put that out to make that clear. But by singling out this case, because it leads to the ramification internationally of what's geopolitically at stake, and because we can make enough of a stink on the question of the congressional action, and because the people who have been targeted are uniting, as we're seeing here today, and we saw on Wednesday, they're uniting and not stepping back and not cowering, that we can take a scalp, we can knock out a lead duck, and then through that begin to unravel and roll back the entirety of the operation. That's what I would say on that for the moment.
I think this gets at another question, which is the role of so-called hybrid warfare, and the fact that you have from NATO, from the U.S. military, a concerted effort. And this is what the Atlantic Council's talking about, Chatham House and others, whose message wins, whose narrative wins. And they're very much concerned about that. And so what we're talking about is making it clear that this is not about narratives, this is about truth. Now, someone sent in a question that I don't know if anyone knows the answer to this. Maybe you do, Gretchen, but is there any organization documenting Ukrainian war crimes? We know that the OECD was pretty much ran away from Ukraine pretty quickly. So they ask, is there anyone in the West looking at this? Because what's being done is the destruction of a nation in the name of defending democracy. And as we've pointed out, this has nothing to do with democracy. It's a targeting of Russia. So, Gretchen, do you know, or Diane, or David, do you know?
I don't know if David does. I don't have know of that. It's a good question. I think Eva Bartlett might be someone we should ask. Oh, Diane.
No, just remember, we just had the Amnesty International report saying that they're committing war crimes, right? And then Zelensky said, how dare anyone ever say that we're not the victims? And I'm sure Amnesty International would be on the hit list if they put organizations on it.
Yeah,
that's absolutely true. They did. The Ukrainian government did condemn Amnesty International as some kind of Russian propaganda outfit, which is outrageous. Amnesty International has never been pro-Russian or biased in any way. But it is very concerning, the way that the Biden administration and other Western media has, whitewashed evidence of Ukrainian war crimes. The idea that, that if you're a nation that's invaded, you can commit whatever egregious war crimes or assassinations you want because you're the one who's defending yourself. That's something we were taught in World War II, and that's something that should be totally debunked. With the atomic bombings, the terror bombings, the illegal starvation blockade of Germany and Japan. Obviously that was a righteous fight in terms of defeating Hitlerism and Nazi Germany, but we essentially ended up adopting Hitler's methods in order to win the war, even though all of those war crimes did not contribute in the least, including the atomic bombings, I would argue, to victory in the war. So we have to stand for truth. We have to expose all war crimes, be they Russian or Ukrainian, and say that it's all unacceptable. But we have to stand for peace. And right now, Russia is the only country that's really brought forward substantive peace proposals and have expressed real interest in peace and ending the war. Ukraine did it in the past in March and early April before we intervened against that. So we need to convince U.S. leaders and the Biden administration to follow the more rational path of course of action that's been advocated by French, German, and Italian leaders to come up with a compromise peace with Russia.
Now, there are a couple of questions which I'll lump together and give each of you a chance to answer as kind of a way of wrapping this up. But before we go to that, I just want to add to what was just said. Sanctions themselves are war crimes. The sanctions, for example, being imposed on Afghanistan, on Yemen, on many, many countries that have been targeted, are killing people. As Madeleine Albright said, she thought it was justifiable to kill 500,000 Iraqi children with sanctions because she thought that contributed to getting rid of Saddam Hussein. That's the kind of immorality that's represented by this great power commitment to control the narrative. And as Helga has been emphasizing, there's a boomerang effect that sanctions are affecting the situation very much so in Europe. I see it here in Germany where people are scrambling to buy wood stoves for this winter and you can't find them. They're not available because so many people have run out to get them. And people are talking about leaving the country. So this brings me to the last question, because there are people who have asked, with hunger and cold facing people in Europe, the United Kingdom, the effects of inflation, energy shortages in the United States. I mean, don't forget, California is heading toward blackouts. You had the blackouts in Texas a year and a half ago. So with this breakdown, this visible breakdown of the system, does this give us an opportunity to change the population, to get them to orient toward the win-win proposals coming from Russia and China, possibly creating an interest in joining with the BRICS and others, or as Xi Jinping proposed to Trump, U.S. should join the Belt and Road Initiative. How do you see this shaping the political fight in the period ahead? And I'll start with you, David, and then Gretchen, and then Diane.
I view it as a positive. I've been hoping that Putin would shut down natural gas to Europe, because that's really what we need. We need a popular revolt, essentially, a peaceful revolt against these warmongering policies by Western leaders in the U.S. and NATO and the EU to support peace. And I'm not saying that Russia's a force for peace overall, but they have very limited objectives. And Putin is not trying to reassemble the Soviet Union, as many neoconservatives have claimed. He's not trying to take over all of Ukraine. He's not even trying to overthrow the Zelensky regime. He's expressed a desire for independence for the Donbass region. Now, admittedly, if the Donbass were to become independent, it would eventually be reunified with Russia. There's no question about that. But he's willing to give up all the additional territories that Russian troops have occupied. So that is not the behavior we would expect from a modern day Stalin or modern day Hitler. So I think that's an important point. But in terms of overall peace, I myself am not a supporter of free, globalist, unilateral free trade with China. I do view China as a threat. Russia, I think, is only an enemy because U.S. policies have made them an enemy. And so I think that it would be in the U.S. national security interest to pursue a strategic partnership with Russia. Obviously, that before that could occur, we have to normalize diplomatic and especially trade relations with Russia. We have to end this unnecessary war that's been provoked by the Biden administration in Ukraine. and then we need to take a step back and kind of withdraw all Western NATO troops from Eastern Europe, and Russia would have to withdraw all of its troops, obviously, from the rest of Ukraine and from Belarus. And then we can have, we can negotiate a mutual security agreement, not too dissimilar from what Russia proposed in December, that actually would be very much in the U.S. national security interests. And perhaps, that would essentially force us to establish a two-tier system within NATO, where our nuclear guarantee would only apply to Western NATO, Western Europe, and not to Eastern Europe. But I think that would be very much in the U.S. interest. I think it was the expansion of NATO eastward that caused us to come in unnecessary conflict with Russia. I don't think Russia wants war with the U.S. China doesn't as well. They want to pursue peaceful relations, and I think we need to do everything we can to support that.
Okay, thank you for that. Gretchen, do you have some thoughts on this?
Well, I think that the collapse of we're facing a total breakdown of the system that has ruled the world since 1971, basically, increasingly, which is when we went from any semblance of a physical, economic, production-oriented economy as a basis for planning, for national planning or international relations with people, by going to straightforward finance rules all, with the breakup of the new Bretton Woods system. So what that does, I actually enjoyed Diane's discussion of the Genghis Khan box idea, because when you read the CCD material, for example, you get what is it, like you feel like you're suffocating because it's so stupid. It's absolutely stupid. And they're demanding that people repeat things that are ludicrous, like the sanctions aren't affecting our economy. So that Genghis Khan box is being broken up, and NATO can have develop all the cognitive warfare plans that they want out of their Norfolk unit down there, but they don't understand the human. What's telling about that, it's based on a view of the human mind as just a physical brain. They have no understanding of what the human mind is. It's the human mind and the power of the human mind as a creative force in the universe based on agape, or love of mankind and one's nation and the future, posterity. You have a place in history. And they don't understand that. And under conditions of breakdown, I think that they are in quite a losing proposition. I think that we can, if we move on this, if we take seriously, we've caught them in a specific thing where we can make them pay. If we move on that, then we are at the same time moving on providing, in this very, very tumultuous period we're moving into, a framework where we can get the United States and European countries, and then an England and an Ireland and a Scotland, perhaps, rather than King Charles's empire, to join together in actually collaborating on building our way not only out of the total collapse that we've gotten ourselves into, but going outward and exploring the universe we live in. That's what I would say. I think it's a moment of tremendous, tremendous opportunity if we never give up and keep promoting ideas.
Well, thank you. And Diane, I know you're not about to give up, so I'll give you the last word on this.
Okay, thanks. Well, first of all, I just want to say something about the China situation, because I respectfully disagree with David Pyne about China being an adversary, and also the characterization of the Uyghur situation, which really is an interesting model and should frankly be studied a little bit, given that part of this terrorist menace was fueled by our activities in Afghanistan when we were running the proxy war against the Soviet Union and arming and training and recruiting terrorists. And I think partly had the idea that you could create a terrorist force that would overthrow the government of China, and which carried out many atrocities, particularly 2013, 2014, I think was the time frame of the explosions, stabbings with machetes on the trains and things like that. And contrary to the Obama policy of bringing in drones and eliminating people at weddings and funerals and engendering a general hatred of the United States and creating conditions where people could recruit to terrorism, there was an approach taken there, probably different from the way that we might do it, but really to eradicate poverty, to find the most extreme elements, but then to also establish vocational schools, not concentration camps, where you could transform people's and bring in teachers of moderate Islam, etc., to change the culture and to increase the per capita income and the standard of living, and create conditions where you could have a more integrated society. And it seems to have been rather effective. I don't think they're having a lot of problems from Uyghur terrorists in China right now. I think, unfortunately, we tend to project a British imperial outlook on the activities of China to build major infrastructure around the world. You hear that all they're doing is creating debt traps and doing it for their own gains. It's really very different. And actually, I think if we look at the history of the United States and the history of China and the history of Russia and the legacy of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who was someone who was extremely influential in the thinking of Lyndon LaRouche, what you see is that the development of our nations coming from different places, perhaps our background and that of Russia might be more closely related than our background and that of China, but there was a reason why Ben Franklin studied Confucius and published some of his analects in his paper, that there is a fight for the development of man. And I think the biggest challenge that we have today, and perhaps the most destructive ideology, is this thing which now, I don't even want to call him King Charles, but the Charles creature who talks about global Britain and wants to impose this green ideology. You're talking about imposing something which is totally unnatural, totally anti-human, to inculcate children with the belief that everything that human beings create is destructive to the planet, and that progress, developing more and more dense forms of energy, which allow us to have a growing population with a higher standard of living, that this is actually a threat, that it's a crime for human beings to have power over nature. That is this ideology is probably the biggest menace that we have facing us right now. And I think that it's really urgent for the world that the United States regain its anti-British imperial identity. There was a reason why we had a revolution against the British Empire. There's a reason why our Declaration of Independence does not say life, liberty, and property, but says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Because the thing that actually gives us each the greatest happiness is to know that we have contributed something that's going to live on after our physical mortal existence, that our life has not only not been in vain, but that our actions have given purpose to the lives of the people who came before and the people who come after us. And the British Empire never forgave us for that, and worked very hard to pervert the principles of the founding of our republic, and to get us to turn into our opposite, which I'm afraid at the moment we're very much acting like exactly what we fought a revolution against. But as LaRouche used to say, the identity of an American is in our DNA, it's in our bones, and I think that it can be revived. And I think if we looked honestly at this very dynamic new relationship shaping up between China, Russia, India, the BRICS nations, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, as the economist Sergei Glaziev said, Lyndon LaRouche, the great American patriot, had a big impact on these things. And I think we would see something that gives us a pathway to return to our actual intended identity. And I think it's absolutely possible. It's not guaranteed. And I think that's why we're all here fighting for this.
Well, thank you for that, Diane. And David, I have something from one of our activists in Utah to call to your attention. The LaRouche organization in Utah is mobilizing to have Mike Lee call for an investigation and shut down the financing of the Committee to Combat Disinformation and Mirotverets. I know you're active there in Utah. You and I sometimes are on the same radio station there. Maybe we can get together and get Mike Lee to take the lead in this.
I think that's a great idea. It's extremely important that we cut off all support for these kind of terroristic, fascistic organizations. It's very anti-American. The U.S. Should not support any organization or fund it, let alone fund an organization that supports criminalizing free thought and particularly targeting people for assassination on the basis of political disagreement, patriotic political disagreement. Reasonable minds can differ. That's what the part of the foundation of the United States of America is, that we're supposed to have peaceful political discourse, and any legitimate nonviolent ideology is to be welcomed. So yeah, I would strongly support that. I just wanted to say also, in response to your previous question, I realized I didn't fully answer it. I think the economic sanctions have backfired really badly. The Biden sanctions against Russia, the Western countries are we're all under recession. We're having record high inflation. Russia, of course, is in recession as well, but their GDP is likely to be reduced, according to latest projections, by 6% versus 50 to 60% for Ukraine. So if the Biden administration truly cared about Ukraine and the Ukrainian people, which apparently doesn't, it would want to end this war as soon as possible, so that 50% of Ukrainians who are unemployed could go back to work, businesses could reopen, and the Ukrainian economy could revive, and we could begin the reconstruction process, which could be in part Western financed. So, it's an illusion, I think, for Republicans, Democrats in this country, both elected officials and citizens, to support this really fundamentally anti-Ukraine. It's pro-Zelensky regime policy, but it's an anti-Ukrainian people policy that we have going on in the Biden administration.
Well, I'd like to thank all our panelists, all of you who stayed on with us to take up the questions. I think the important thing that we took up with this conference that Helga Zepp-LaRouche intended is that we inspire humanity so that we can survive this crisis. And I hope people have gotten that message. I would urge you, share the link to these discussions from the first panel and the second panel. Watch the press briefing from last Thursday, which is on the Schiller Institute site. And most importantly, become active. Too many people talk about how we have no power, how they're so powerful and we're so weak. But as we've been discussing, there's something emerging that's new. The Eurasian integration, the Asian economic cooperation. And all of these go back to something Lyndon LaRouche always talked about with great passion, which is the power of reason, the power of ideas. That's the power that we have. And we have to deploy it, because that's the way that you can change history. So let me close by saying tomorrow we start at 10 a.m. We'll have a discussion of walking through the LaRouche Digital Library, and then the second session will be on the cultural policy that's required to raise people back to the standards of the citizens of the American revolutionary tradition. So with that, thanks to everyone, and we'll see you tomorrow.